Session 9, the Wisdom Era. The Wisdom Era isn't so much an era as it is a type of literature. It refers to the books of Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and certain Psalms. As the moniker implies, wisdom literature seeks to impart wisdom to the people of God. Now, oftentimes, wisdom is considered a separate class or separate type of literature from everything else in the Old Testament. So most Old Testament theologies don't even treat it, or they do so with a passing glance. But when we read wisdom literature through the framework of the Promise Plan, then we see how it ties together many of the strands we have already discussed. In fact, I believe that wisdom literature is one of the best evidences of the unity of the Bible. So let's begin with the book of Job. As we've already discussed, the events that happened during the book of Job happened in the patriarchal era, during the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the content of the book is decidedly a part of wisdom literature. Job's contribution to the promised plan of God is fascinating, and what I'm about to give you is not Kaiser but Cuthbert. So you're allowed to treat this with the appropriate level of suspicion. But I will warn you, most of what I'm about to say is stolen from Tim Keller, so take that as you will. We have discussed how, in light of the covenant sealing ceremony of Genesis 15, that the promise of God is unilateral, unconditional. In the book of Job, we have a story where Satan tries to flip the tables on God. Job is described as a man who feared God and shunned evil. When Satan appears before God after roaming the earth, God suggests that he should consider his servant Job. Satan claimed that the only reason why Job continued to love God was because of the blessing and protection that God provided. In other words, Job didn't really love God. Job loved himself and merely used God towards that end. The book which followed is a story demonstrating Job's love for God. It demonstrated that his love was not dependent on the things that God provided. Job loved God for who he was. So if Job loved God unconditionally, it stands to reason that God would match and exceed this unconditional love. So read through the framework of the promise plan, the story of Job challenges the assumption that God's relationship with mankind is merely transactional. Let's turn to the book of Proverbs. There are many themes that we could discuss about how wisdom literature reflects the themes of the promise plan, but two stand out. One theme we see repeated throughout the book of Proverbs is the fear of the Lord. We saw this theme referenced in Job when he was described as a man who feared God and shunned evil. And I fear that our current culture obscures the power of this theme. And this is kind of a hobby horse for me, so I ask your forgiveness in advance. Today we tend to consider the fear of the Lord as merely respect for or compliance to God. We even have worship songs that tell us that fear is a liar. And I understand the spirit in which these songs are written, and I don't fundamentally disagree with their sentiment. However, I believe they use the wrong words to express it. The fear of the Lord has been a consistent theme throughout the Scriptures. Abraham in Genesis 22:12 offered his son Isaac up as an offering because he feared the Lord. Abraham saw what God could do to Sodom and Gomorrah. He saw his wife conceive at an old age. Abraham knew the power of God. The book of Exodus similarly expresses the value of the fear of the Lord. Beginning in chapter 1, we read that the midwives feared God. Israel, after she witnessed the power of God through the plagues and her miraculous deliverance, is said to have feared God. And this fear drove them to avoid sin, as it had done with Job. The book of Deuteronomy drove home this idea of the fear of the Lord. In Deuteronomy, the fear of the Lord went hand in hand with keeping God's commandments. The fear of the Lord is the motto of Proverbs expressed in chapter 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. But still, many people object to the use of the term fear. However, when anyone comes face to face with God in the Bible, fear is the appropriate response. When Joshua was confronted by the angel of the Lord, he fell down out of fear. And the angel had to encourage him, saying, "Do not be afraid." Notice that the angel did not question what Joshua was doing. He didn't say, "Joshua, what on earth are you doing down there? Get up. You don't have to fear me." No, the angel recognized that Joshua's response was a proper one and had to encourage him by saying, "Fear not." Similarly, when Isaiah came into the throne room of heaven, he was terrified because he thought the angel coming down from the altar would smite him with that burning coal. So Isaiah exclaimed, "Woe to me." And I'm afraid a lot of Christians have this vision of when they meet Jesus, they'll be running through fields of flowers and they'll throw their arms around Jesus. I'm not exactly sure that's how it will go down. Like Isaiah, our natural response when we come face to face with perfect holiness is an acute awareness of our own sinfulness. This awareness leads to a sense of our natural destiny, which is death. The good news of the gospel is not that we have no reason to be afraid, because we do have reason to be afraid. The miracle of the gospel is that God declares grace on us instead of justice. God does not wipe out the demands of justice. He overcomes the demands of justice. The gospel is like picking us up off the ground, like Joshua, and declaring, "Fear not." There's a fallacy that love and fear are mutually exclusive. I remember when I joined the Army, I was a little nervous because there's one thing I've never really been able to control or master in my life, and that's my body's response to a vaccination. Vaccinations, they don't really hurt that much. I know that they're good for me. I've never been able to control my body's response to them. I get lightheaded, I start to go down, it's not a good sight. And on the second day that you're in the Army, before you even get to basic training, you're in reception. You have to go through medical. And when I went through in 2001, 2002, we had to get 17 vaccinations in about the span of maybe 30 to 45 seconds. And they had 4 lines on the floor. And you'd step up to one line, and you can get 2 in one arm, 2 in the other. You step up to the next line, 4 more, 4 more, 4 more. And then to top it off, we had to pull our pants halfway down. They gave us this experimental vaccine with a big honking long needle just to top it off. And I remember waiting for my turn to go. And I wasn't really thrilled about this. But you know what? I was actually more scared of the drill sergeants at that particular moment than I was of the vaccinations. And the vaccinations went fine. I mean, as fine as vaccinations can go, I get. And I even remember coming back from basic training. I was enrolled in seminary, and I needed a booster to one of those vaccinations. So I just told the nurse, "Okay, yep, I'm a big, strong soldier now. I must be past this, right?" And she gave me this vaccination, and I got so lightheaded, she asked me to lay down. So I got to know my seminary classmates by having them step over me in line at Gordon Conwell. That was lovely, big bad soldier, right? This is an illustration of how fear can work. I was afraid of the proper thing. I was more afraid of what the drill sergeant can do than the vaccinations. But you know what? By the time my term in basic training was done, these drill sergeants were still scary. They still evoked fear. But I love these guys because I realized they yelled at me because they cared about me. They wanted to see me come home from deployment and do well. Fear and love are not mutually exclusive. So if I were to modify some of the theology of these worship songs coming out these days, I would suggest that it is not fear that is the liar, but fear of the wrong thing is the liar. We see this theme of the fear of the Lord through Scripture, and especially in the wisdom literature. Fear of the proper person is the first thing we have to realize in order to express wisdom. The second theme of wisdom literature is closely connected to and arises out of this. Much has been made of the relationship between pagan wisdom sayings and the wisdom literature, but what is even more remarkable is the relationship between the law and the Proverbs, really the law and all wisdom literature. As Proverbs 1:7 tells us, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. One might ask, what is this instruction of spoken here? This instruction is the law. In fact, the Proverbs really are the law, just in a different format. Kaiser's included a fascinating little chart on page 133 to demonstrate the commonalities between the law and wisdom. Therefore, the Proverbs draws on this antecedent theology and continues the process of Israel becoming the people of God and Yahweh taking his place as God over Israel. Let's move on to the book of Ecclesiastes. This book has been misunderstood due to an unfortunate mistranslation in the beginning of the book. Ecclesiastes 1:2 reads, "Meaningless, meaningless," says the teacher, "utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." The Hebrew word hebel, translated as meaningless or vanity, according to Kaiser, should be better understood as transitoriness or changeableness. Solomon is not telling us here that life is just a big waste of time. Instead, he is telling us, according to Kaiser, that God is making all things beautiful in his time. This fits well with one of the better-known passages of Ecclesiastes, which tells us that there's a time for everything under heaven. The book concludes with the consummation of this process. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. This verse summarizes the consummation of human history. Fear God and keep his commandments. This phase of eternity will end with judgment, and even the hidden things will come into view to be judged. God's promise plan is progressively moving towards a conclusion, the fulfillment of the promise. In summary, there's much more here worth your time and effort than we have time to cover. But we have seen that wisdom literature teaches us, through the book of Job, that God's relationship with his people is not transactional, in the sense that God will fulfill the promise unconditionally, in the same way that Job loved God regardless of the comforts and provisions he had become used to. We have seen that the fear of the Lord is central to keeping the commands of God. Since these commands are central to becoming a people of God, then the fear of the Lord was and continues to be a vehicle for fulfilling the promise. In fact, much of this wisdom literature is simply a presentation of the law in a different format, and therefore stands as a monument to the goodness of the law. We learn from Ecclesiastes that life is transitory, and in fact is moving towards an end, a consummation of the promise. Thank you.